like to introduce a member of our board and a well-known local writer and newspaperman who's been doing historical articles for a long time at the Dartmouth and Westport Chronicle, and often is published in the other local newspapers as well. And he's a genuine researcher into old Dartmouth historical materials. And he's going to talk to us tonight about a very interesting aspect of the Revolution and the period before the Revolution, having to do with the seafaring men of old Dartmouth. And Paul has a lot to offer, and I know you will enjoy it very much. This has been a very loyal member of our organization, helps us tremendously with all the articles he writes about history and about us. And I'm not sure what we would do if we didn't have that kind of coverage. But without any more ado, Mr. Barboza.
Thank you.
And I'll be the slide pusher.
You forgot your gavel. Good evening, everybody. I did try to make a PowerPoint presentation to go with this, but it's not terribly coordinated with what I want to talk about. So, the seeds of this talk came about quite a few years back when I had a conversation with a military history expert, Ron Plord of Dartmouth, a longtime colonial historical character reenactor. And we were talking about local seamen in the American Revolution. And he had this to say about privateers. Some call them pirates and some call them patriots, he said. It depended which side you were on. And that perspective on the question always stuck with me and led me to do quite a bit of research on how people on both sides of the war viewed the matter. To the British, privateers, both privateers and colonial Navy seamen were simply pirates. They were British subjects who were making war against English-owned vessels, either with private commissions signed by the rebellious state governments, or sailing under orders from the unrecognized Federation of Rebellious Colonies. Pretty much Royal Navy and Royal Army officers considered all American seamen and soldiers as simply damn rebels who were traitors to the crown. At sea, they were simply common pirates who unlawfully attacked British ships and stole both the ships and their cargoes in most cases. But looking at the tradition dating back centuries, privateering was always a questionable business. Sometimes the sailors and officers on privateer ships were legitimate government agents, licensed and bonded, acting in the nation's interests in time of war. Sometimes, between frequent wars, they often worked just as unauthorized pirates. The situation often depended on the year, the general economic conditions, and whether their country was legally at war with someone at the time. You got to figure, if you had spent the past decade, say, plundering French ships under a privateer charter, it was unlikely you would pass up the chance to rob them again or steal their ship just because a peace treaty had been signed the week before. Since communications aren't what they were now, you could always claim the prize had been seized legitimately in wartime, and like the pirates used in the old days, if you walked the plank, if there were no witnesses to the crime, who would know? So let's go all the way back to the roots of privateering in the Americas to see how the practice started in the first place. The term privateer strictly refers to private vessels working for the government in time of war. Ship owners were issued letters of marque authorizing them to attack vessels of other countries their government was at war with. without fear of being hanged as pirates. Typically, the government got 1/3 of the value of the captured ships or cargo, called a prize. The ship owner and any partners who financed the privateer vessels got another third share, and the rest of the prize money was divided up among the officers and crewmen. For a common seaman or a country farm laborer who might make $10 or $20 a year if he had a decent job, chance to come home from a short but risky voyage with a share of a decent prize worth maybe $50 or $100 was well worth it. That much money made you rich enough to buy your own farm, maybe a herd of cattle or sheep, or maybe even buy a little boat and a cannon or swivel gun and go out privateering on your own and make more money. For the already rich ship owners, it was usually a chance to become even wealthier by risking your ships, but not your life. The first recorded privateers in New England were 3 Rhode Island men who sailed out of Newport, Rhode Island in 1652. Edward Hull, John Underhill, and Thomas Baxter. They carried commissions from the colonial governor, an English official, to go after Dutch vessels at sea and to attach Dutch outposts in the New York area. Rhode Island, founded in 1638, was one of New York's biggest business rivals, so they thought that was a legitimate enterprise. The main targets of the Rhode Island privateers were the unarmed merchant ships carrying goods to and from New York and the Dutch colonies in the Caribbean. And it was a profitable business. It was so profitable that after the war ended, some of the privateers carried on the business without the benefit of government sanction, becoming real pirates, either part-time or full-time. Others used their nautical experience to become smugglers, and Rhode Island soon became known as a friendly place to both smugglers and pirates. By 1698, royal officials in America were regularly complaining that the Rhode Island Colonial Assembly was actively aiding and sheltering both smugglers and pirates working out of that colony. And from all indications, it was certainly true. Stolen and smuggled goods were regularly sold on the Newport docks and street corners, and some local legislators were involved in those illegal activities. The British were almost always at war with someone over the next 100 years. And whenever war broke out, pirates, smugglers, and legitimate ship owners all rushed to get government commissions to go privateering. The first privateers sailed under this particular flag. It's a variation of, can you go to the next slide, please? The flag on the left is known as the Red Duster, which was the colonial flag of any merchant ship that was part of the British Empire. And as soon as hostilities broke out, the war started. We know that George Washington kept the Union Jack part of the flag. Somebody, allegedly Betsy Ross, but probably not, came up with the patent of 13 stripes, symbolized the 13 colonies, and we'll see later on that they added the 13 stars to make the familiar flag that we came to know so well. Next slide. Okay, back to our text. One of the most famous pirates of the colonial era was the famous Captain Kidd of New York, who earned a reputation for bravery as a privateer during England's King William's War against the French, which started in 1696. He was in fact hired by rich merchants to lead an expedition against pirates in the West Indies, and was given a privateer's commission allowing him to attack any French ships that he came across while he was chasing the pirates. He never caught any pirates on that trip, but he did quite a bit of privateering and also a little pirate work, ending up not in the Caribbean, but taking a trip around Africa, going as far as the Indian Ocean, where he captured several valuable Muslim ships. And it was these unauthorized captures that got him and his crew charged with piracy when they returned home 2 years later. Governor of New York ended up sending Captain Kidd to London in chains, seized all the loot he'd brought home. The British government hanged him for being a pirate. Queen Anne's war against the French started in 1702, giving colonial seamen even more experience in the privateering business, and providing huge amounts of cash and seized goods that stimulated the New England economy greatly. When the war finally ended, some captains and crews facing unemployment or just missing the great cash flow turned back to piracy and smuggling again. In fact, smuggling untaxed molasses past custom officials became a major industry in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, which had hundreds of rum refineries that used molasses to make the popular liquor. Of course, the rum was also traded in Africa for black slaves for colonial plantations, mostly in the West Indies, where they grew sugarcane to make more molasses and more rum. This was known as the Triangle Trade, which made many American businessmen wealthy in colonial times. Also employed thousands making ships, barrels, rope, and other products needed for maritime industry. Piracy on a large scale had pretty much been wiped out by the determined efforts of the Royal Navy by 1725, when the British and colonial governments finally decided that all the pirates had to go because maritime industry was so important to the economy. Part-time pirates laid low or went back to legitimate maritime business until the next war broke out so they could become privateers again. You can see how this pattern of regular privateering opportunities gave American colonists lots of experience fighting at sea. Experience that would provide plenty of volunteers for similar service against the British when the Revolution started. Let's go back to that original quote. Some call them pirates and some call them patriots. In the American Revolution, it was truly a matter of which side of the war you were on. The British called the colonial privateers, caused them so much trouble, bloody pirates who stole ships and cargoes, and also crippled the British effort to put down the rebellion of the North American colonies. The American colonists called them patriots because they did so much to win America's freedom from Great Britain. Probably as much as all the soldiers who fought the redcoats on land and the Minutemen who defended their hometowns. This illustration gives you just an example of the kind of ships the privateers were sailing. Everything from large converted whaleboats, very often with one or two small cannons. That's a swivel gun, which is essentially a big bore shotgun that shot a bag full of pellets at the enemy. If you want to come up and board an enemy vessel, that's a pretty effective weapon. This is a brigand. This is the next size. That's a sloop-rigged boat. One of the most common coastal trading vessels in the colonies at the time. Easily manned by a crew of anywhere from half a dozen to 2 dozen men. they were probably the most common ship used as privateers. Basically, all you had to do was cut a few gun holes in the bulwarks, reinforce them a little bit, get a couple of cannon, and you were in business. Privateers' prey was almost always unarmed merchantmen. They didn't really ever want to go up against a Royal Navy warship because they had bigger and better cannon, better trained crews. You could figure half of the crew of a privateer were probably what they call landsmen, guys who had no experience as sailors. They were just on board there to fire muskets, intimidate the enemy, and board a ship if they had to. The Americans issued almost 1,700 privateer commissions during the war. According to official records, these warships captured about 2,280 English ships and seized millions of dollars worth of cargoes. Especially important were the cannons, powder, and other military supplies vitally needed by the colonies to wage war. They were fortunate at the time, especially at the start of the war. The Royal Navy was in between wars. They would generally mothball half their ships, lay off all of the sailors and half of the officers, and they wouldn't call them back until the next war started. So when the Revolution started, or just before it, the Royal Navy was in a weakened condition. It was still the best, the most powerful Navy in the world, but quite a few of the crewmen on those British ships were actually colonists. They're back in England. Most of the good sailors didn't want to serve in the Royal Navy under tyrant captains for low pay and risky business, so they were in the merchant fleet. And the same thing in the Americas. So, on those 1,700 privateers officially commissioned during the war, more than 1,300 of them were eventually captured by the Royal Navy. The crews and captains were thrown into British prisons or given the option of joining the crew of whatever Royal Navy ship had captured them. Many American naval heroes served on both privateers and on Continental Navy ships. In fact, the first commander of the new American Navy, Commodore Isaac Hopkins of Rhode Island, was a former privateer for the British before the American Revolution and earned a reputation as a fierce warrior in that service, which helped him get the command of the first American Naval Squadron. Let's take a look at Dartmouth's role in this business. Once the war started, the British, of course, were occupying Boston, which was the biggest port in New England at the time, biggest commercial port. So the American privateers and the fledgling Continental Navy had to find a safe harbor, or safe harbors, to conduct their business from. One of the biggest ones was Bedford Village. Quite a few privateers sailed out of Salem, Newburyport. Of course, we know that Bedford Village paid a very steep price for being both a supply depot and a base for privateers and Navy ships. Being subjected to a devastating British attack on Bedford Village neighboring Fairhaven and our own Padenham village in September 1778. And the goal of that British raid was simple: to eliminate the privateer base that New Bedford had become, destroy as many of the privateer ships and captured British vessels that they could find there, and of course to destroy the warehouses on both sides of the harbor that were jammed with captured cargoes waiting to be sold. The warehouses were mostly all burned to the ground by the British, along with quite a few of the ships floating in the harbor, and numerous homes and businesses, especially the local shipyards. Old Dartmouth's role in the Revolutionary War was especially important because it was one of the best safe harbors in between the biggest British naval bases. After the British left Boston, of course, they went and occupied New York, and they still continued to blockade Boston, so it was a tough port to get in and out of, as was New York. But they were constantly shuttling supplies and men back and forth between the big naval base in Nova Scotia, Halifax, Nova Scotia, New York. So there were always supply ships and transports going back and forth up and down the coast, and Dartmouth became a very convenient place to sail out of, snatch a few enemy ships, and then come back again. It became such an important place to both the Continental Navy and the privateers. The British Major General Charles Grey, who headed up the attack on Dartmouth at the time, called it a nest of privateers. Dartmouth's reputation as a safe harbor, gained early in the conflict, was helped by two shore batteries, one at Clark's Cove and the other on the Fairhaven side of the Acushnet River. It was a great place to hide from the Royal Navy, to restock your ship with food and water, and of course a great place to find experienced seamen who could fill out the crew if you needed one. Both Bedford and Padenham Harbor were frequented by privateers and state naval vessels, and eventually the Continental Navy. Within a year of the first letter of marque being issued by a colonial court, the privateers had become so troublesome that the Royal Navy had to escort virtually every supply convoy sent to America to ensure its safe arrival. But in time, bigger and faster privateers would be experienced and often sufficiently armed with heavy cannons to take on the British frigates and sloops that were escorting these supply ships. And eventually they got good enough at it that they captured more than one British man of war before the end of the conflict. In 1888, how are we doing on the slideshow? The biggest problem with the Americans trying to prosecute a war is they had a great shortage of cannon and other weaponry. That small picture is a typical naval cannon, which you can see is pretty much a standard cannon taking off a rolling carriage and mounted on a smaller carriage that could be used at sea. This illustration gives a good example of the different kind of shells that were used. They didn't just shoot cannonballs at the enemy. They had specialized bar shot, and They also used a chain slung between two cannonballs that they would shoot at the enemy to take down their masks and cut up their rigging, cripple the ship so they could close and board it. This handy dandy little weapon looks like a sawed-off shotgun, which essentially it was, something called a C-bus, which they would pack with birdshot or pellet, and the guy leading the boarding party going to attack the enemy ship would, after they shot off the swivel guns to help clear the enemy deck, the first guys over the side would let loose with those little portable cannons to disrupt the defenders. Interesting footnote in one of the books on the Continental Marines that I saw. One of the first appropriations of Congress for the new Marine units was 1,300 of those. Basically, every Marine detachment on a Continental Navy ship had a bunch of those. The Marines were, of course, the guys that went over the side and tried to take out the enemy. What's the next slide? Of course, the privateers love to prey on unarmed ships. Basically, if you sailed up to somebody who didn't have any cannon to defend themselves, you would either threaten to sink them or board them and kill everybody on board. And I don't know, best guesses are 50 to 75% of the privateers never fired a shot. They would just sail up to a ship and say, surrender or we're going to sink you. And most of them surrendered, especially if it wasn't your ship. You don't want to die for somebody else's cargo. They're all insured, and the ship was insured. You're probably not getting paid enough to risk getting killed for. The next one? Same thing. If you, of course, a lot of the merchantmen, after the war started and the privateers were extremely successful, they started arming themselves. They would carry extra crewmen armed with muskets and swords in case they had to defend themselves. And sometimes they had a few small cannon on board just so a privateer might pass you by instead of risk a fight. Next one, number 7. That's a pretty interesting statistic too. The thing on the right is advertisement. Of course, there was no mass media in those days, but if somebody was outfitting a privateer, they would have a bunch of handbills printed up and say, we're going on a cruise next month. Here's where we're sailing from and who you apply to if you want to go aboard. And you would see that by that chart, by 1776, the numbers started rising rapidly. And one of the reasons for that was basically once the Royal Navy ramped up their efforts to build up their fleet, blockade the American coast, the maritime industry basically shut down. And you get a figure in New England, it was anywhere from a third to a half of the local economies. A place like Dartmouth, New Bedford, this part of state, whaling was already getting to be a pretty popular business. The roads were terrible in those days. Most freight moved by sea. You wanted to get something from, say, Fairhaven to Westport, then called the Coxit. It would probably take you 2 days, something heavy. It might take you 3 days to get it there by ox cart or by wagon. But you could probably move the same freight half a day or so. If you moved it by ship, you moved it from dock to dock, and wagons moved it from there. So the numbers show that as the maritime economy shut down and privateering proved profitable for ship owners who had a lot of ships and experienced crews and captains waiting to get some work, the numbers increased greatly. The early successes also made it easy to recruit men. And later on, we'll get to look at some of the numbers, which made it obvious why experienced sailors wouldn't join the Continental Navy if they were going to risk their lives at sea. It was a much smarter proposition to sign on to a privateer than join the Navy. The next one is just for laughs. I put in the contract that William Kidd signed with the governor of New York for his, can you go back one? To do his pirate patrols. And the second page of that document, which I didn't include, includes his privateer commission. At the time, England was in one of its many wars with France, and he was given a privateer commission to seize any French vessels he came across. The one on the left is part of the licensing process for a privateer. This one happened to be for the brig Vengeance and Captain Wingate Newman. You probably can't read it, but it pretty much spells out what he's allowed to do under the law. He can legitimately attack, seize British vessels and cargoes. He's not supposed to interfere with any ships of neutral nations. Most of these privateers were all had to be bonded by the state, so the owners and the captain would promise that anything they seized would legally be brought back and disposed of in the American version of the Admiralty Court, which was called a settlement court, which sometimes met in Dartmouth, but in this southern district was most often held in Plymouth, because the government wanted to make sure they got their share. They didn't want anybody sneaking off to the Indies and selling the captured shipping cargo in, say, a Dutch colony or a French possession and not paying the government share. You got to realize in those days there were no real documentation for ship ownership or registries or any of that. If you just showed up in some port with a ship and said, yeah, this is my boat, you want to buy it cheap? $1,000 or 1,000 pounds to buy this boat. And so you came home and you said, well, we didn't capture any ships and we didn't get any cargo, so whatever. So the bonds and the commission documents would also help you prove while you were at sea. If, say, a French warship pulled you over and said, prove to me you're not an English vessel, you could produce this document. And it would suggest that you were legally an American ship and an ally of France, and you shouldn't be captured and sold at auction yourself. Most of these ships were owned by the richest folks around, very often a little coalition of the ship owner, the shipbuilder, ship captain, a couple of investors, because it was, of course, a risky business, privateering, and it was just as likely you were going to lose your ship as capture somebody else's and get back successfully. So very often there were 4 or 5 well-to-do folks who would get together, put up the bond, pay the considerable money to outfit the ship. Most of these privateer cruises were 2 or 3 months of 1, 2, 3 months in duration. So you had 50 men on board. You had to stock it with provisions and arms and food and water and all the rest. It's expensive business. Almost everybody also bought insurance in case they lost the boat or if it was severely damaged. And if you look in research materials, my favorite, of course, is the U.S. Navy's history, Naval Documents of the Revolution. And there's a cool, very cool website called American War for Independence at Sea. And you can look up a ship like the Vengeance. You can find out exactly who owned it, who was the captain of it, what times the cruises, how many men and what armaments it had, how long the cruises were, where they went, what they captured. And you can find the bondholders on those lists. And you'd be surprised how many of these ships were either owned or invested in by Dartmouth men. What's the next one going to be? Next slide, Bob. Well, just for illustration purposes, the guy on the left is Isaac Hopkins, famous privateer for the British before the war started. He's reportedly the guy who spearheaded the attack of the Providence men on the revenue cutter Gaspee 5 years before the war started. Some say he was the guy who shot the British lieutenant who commanded the revenue cutter Gaspee. Just for popularity's sake, Captain John Paul Jones, considered by many to be the father of the American Navy. He was a very experienced seaman and later a captain of merchant vessels. Next one is, I think we're going back to the, we can stop there for a while. An 1888 American Antiquarian Society report mentions quite a few privateers from Dartmouth, which, when I use the term Dartmouth, of course, is Old Dartmouth, which included today's New Bedford, Fairhaven, and Acushnet. to the east, as well as Westport, then called the Coxet, and Dartmouth. They included the privateer Warren, a 6-gun sloop owned and crewed mostly by Dartmouth men. One of the largest was the Fanny, an 18-gun brig with a crew of 100 men, owned by Adam Babcock and Archibald Blair, often described as Dartmouth men, but I'm not quite sure about that. I haven't researched them enough to be sure. As I said, early on in the war, when Boston was blockaded, the port was shut down by the British, blockaded by the Royal Navy. A lot of the Boston merchants relocated their businesses. Since they couldn't sail out of Boston, they relocated to places like Salem and Dartmouth or Newport before the British took that over, and just conducted their business from there. The smallest of the local privateers was probably the gunboat Prudence, which reportedly sailed with a crew of 8 men and a single swivel gun for armament. Another interesting footnote, in that famous naval history, naval documents of the American Revolution, found an interesting footnote in one of those 11 volumes. It reports a whaleboat sailing out of a Coxet with, I think it was 8 men on board, with a single cannon, or was it a swivel gun? But anyway, they sailed out of a Coxet harbor, out of Westport Harbor one day, and captured, I think it was a Royal Navy packet ship that was sailing by. And I've never been able to find any further reference to it except that one sentence in that one volume of history. But it gives an indication it was probably virtually any port around this part of the country that had, you know, a few brave sailors and a chance to get some kind of armament, went out and would sneak out any opportunity they got and capture anything they could. Some of the other local ships was one schooner called the Rover Galley, owned by somebody called Daniel Epps, allegedly of Dartmouth, equipped with 4 guns and a crew of 25. Epps also signed a bond for the privateer brigantine Hound, carrying 6 guns and 20 men. The ship Eagle was another privateer. It was captured by the British and burned in 1777. Esther, another Dartmouth ship, was also captured by the Royal Navy that year. One of the curious questions I spent a lot of time thinking about when I was working up this talk was, what role did the local Quaker merchants play in this business? A lot of folks hold the belief that because of their pacifist convictions or their loyalty to the crown, they didn't get involved in privateering at all. And there's the famous story that during the British raid of 1778, Elihu Aiken and his brother James, who were Quakers, were reportedly building a brig that was to be outfitted as a privateer. It was burned by the British in that raid. Now, I've always wondered whether they planned to sell it or whether they were going to be part investors in the privateering business or just keep a share of it. By checking those 2 reliable sources, the American War for Independence at Sea, I can find no records of them ever being listed as the owners of a Massachusetts privateer, so we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say they were not involved in the business. There's always the possibility they were secret investors, but let's not speculate. Privateering could be very profitable for both the insured ship owners and brave crewmen who sail them. Typically, a third of the captured cargo and the prize ship's value went to the privateer's owners. The crew divided another third. The final share was kept by the settlement court for the state, which supervised the sale of the seized cargo and supposedly sent all the proceeds to the state treasury. Some other states required half of the profits from the sale of captured ships and goods to go to the state treasury, and the other half was divided by the owners and crews. The local branch of the Massachusetts Bay Settlement Court, meeting in Plymouth or Dartmouth, helped dispose of captured cargoes and vessels seized by local privateers, as well as those from nearby Rhode Island and Connecticut. Once the British occupied Newport, they had a very large blockade fleet shutting off Narragansett Bay. So a lot of the Rhode Island privateers, if they could get past that blockade or were already at sea, they would use Dartmouth and other ports to do business out of. I want to spend a few minutes on a privateer called the Warren, which is a great source for historical researches because of a sailor's diary that was published with this lengthy title. A journal kept by Ephraim Briggs on board of the good sloop Warren, a bold privateer from Dartmouth to the latitude of 33 degrees. The Warren was a 60-ton sloop fitted out at Dartmouth in the summer of 1776 by lawyer Lemuel Williams and shipbuilder Leonard Jarvis. It was equipped with 6 6-pound guns and a crew of 50 men, first sailing under commander John Phillips. This Ephraim Briggs, I don't know if he was a clerk in his other life or just had a literary bent, but he kept a detailed journal of both voyages of the Warren. Warren set sail on her first privateering mission in mid-July 1776. Wyatt Barlow of Rochester was appointed as commander of the vessel on the second voyage that started just about a week later, August 24th, and lasted until the end of September 1776. First prize captured by the Warren was the 170-ton cargo ship Argo, en route from the West Indies to Newfoundland with a cargo of sugar and molasses. It was owned by an American, Thomas Boylston of Boston, but it was under hire to a British firm, which made it fair game for a privateer. Argo was seized on July 31st by the Warren off the New England coast and brought into Dartmouth on August 16th for sale at auction. Second vessel captured by Warren without a fight, I might note, was the 400-ton Indiaman called Isaac, sailing from Jamaica to Liverpool, England, with a valuable cargo of cotton, sugar, and molasses. Crew sailed towards Marblehead. The crew was sailing towards Marblehead, but as it approached Cape Ann on the morning of August 24th, 1776, it was sighted by the Royal Navy ship Milford, a 24-gun frigate. The warship gave pursuit, getting close enough to fire her bow cannon at the American vessel. But Isaac's prize crew wasn't an American vessel, it was a captured vessel. But the Isaac's prize crew raced into Marblehead Harbor under full sail with only slight damage from the 20 shots fired at her by the British ship. The colonial forts in the harbor opened fire and drove off the frigate, according to Mr. Briggs. The prize was quite a financial reward for Warren's owners and the crew, probably earning thousands of dollars at auction. Of course, when I say dollars, these are continental dollars, not quite the same value as English pounds or Spanish gold coins, which were the most common currency at the time. If you want to go to one of the next slides, this gives you a good idea of how successful a privateer voyage might be. These were captures by the privateer brig Freedom, reported in the local newspaper, so we can be sure that they're true and accurate. Everybody can read the numbers. I don't have to go through them for you. I just did the calculations to give an idea of what a typical division of the prize money would be. Of course, early on, before Congress got involved in the business of governing warships, each state had their own rules and regulations. Like I said, some states you would divide the prizes by thirds. This example, I used 50%. So the state took half. The owners and investors get half. Now this was a time when, a typical paycheck for a farmer or a seaman might be $1 a month, $2 a month. If you get lucky and sailed out on a 2 or 3 week cruise and came back with 1 or 2 prizes, you could make some serious money. Next slide shows you a lot how a lot of the local merchants in these parts made their fortunes. Of course, the only people who could afford to buy a ship, outfit it, and put up the advance money for provisions and insurance were well-to-do folks. And just for comparison, I put pay rates for official Navy folks in there, which was why the Continental Navy couldn't half the time send their ships out, because they couldn't crew them. If you were crazy enough to risk your life to go fight at sea, which option would you pick? People on that cruise, each seaman, for maybe a month or 2 work, made the equivalent of what? A lifetime of earnings. Of course, if you want to go to the next slide, it wasn't all easy money and easy pickings either. More than 1,300, my figure is a little fuzzy there. I guess I didn't do the proofreading. More than 1,300 privateers, American privateers, were captured. Thousands and thousands of seamen were given the choice of joining the Royal Navy or going to prison. By all reports, virtually all of the Americans refused to sign on to the Royal Navy and chose prison. Early in the war, because the British government and most of the aristocratic officers who commanded British ships just considered Americans traitors and didn't want to support the privateer or American Navy efforts, they would not exchange American prisoners for British seamen. They kept them in prison. Very often on these prison ships, this is a period illustration of the famous prison ship Jersey. Which is remembered with a monument at Brooklyn Harbor, New York City. It was the worst of the prison ships, and of course they wouldn't feed you, they wouldn't give you any medical care. The sanitation was virtually non-existent. The Americans died by the thousands. Later on, as the British expanded their fleet, their own seamen got so valuable that they started exchanging American prisoners, mostly because they had so many of them. It was so expensive for them to guard them, feed them, etc., that they were willing to exchange them for their own soldiers and sailors, especially after the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, where some 5,000 or 6,000 British soldiers got captured. They suddenly became very eager to start exchanging American prisoners for their own people. Next slide is what? Well, later on, when the Continental Congress finally got together and created these United States, the government got a little more fussy about the rules of privateering. This is the first page of a multi-page document. It's item number 1. The same thing as that other commission or bond that I showed you. It specifies what privateers can do, all the rules they had to follow, the international rules of conduct. And I think we're getting to the end of the little slideshow. Well, Don, since you're here, I might as well mention one of your old ancestors. Old ancestors. There's Patrick Maxfield, Bedford.
Not a direct ancestor, but nevertheless
A relation, okay. He was another of the Dartmouth shipbuilders who got involved in the privateering business when the Revolution started. He's listed in state records as the builder of the privateer brig Maria, carrying 7 or 8 guns, depending on the crews. A crew of about 20 men. Was licensed as a privateer in 1778. Leonard Jarvis, who served as the deputy continental agent for the Dartmouth area, was his partner in the venture, along with Bedford merchant Joseph Russell. Maxfield later served as the second commander of the Maria, taking over the captain's job in January 1781. The ship was eventually captured by the Royal Navy sloops Mentor and Vulture in that year. He eventually won his freedom in a prisoner exchange. He is later mentioned in the state records as being commander of the privateer brig Betsy in 1783. Certainly he was an American Massachusetts patriot, probably partially motivated by the fact that when the British attacked Dartmouth in 1778, his shipyard in Bedford Village was among those businesses burned by the Redcoats. A few other mentions of local men give us clues just how risky that privateer business was. Shipbuilding patriot privateer William Claghorn was another Bedford man whose home was among those burned by the Redcoats in 1778. He appears in state records as the commander of the Massachusetts privateer Virginia, commissioned in 1782. Virginia was a former British merchant ship, Betty, bought by Jonathan Nutting of Boston and several partners at auction after it was captured by a privateer and transformed into an American privateer, armed with 10 cannon, a brace of swivel guns, and a crew of 25 men. Unfortunately, Virginia fell back into British hands in November of 1783, and Captain Claghorn and his crew were among those imprisoned in New York on one of those prison ships. Some other local notables: Continental Navy commissions list First Lieutenant Consider Howland of Dartmouth as one of the men being on parole in early 1777 after his capture by the British. He obtained his release in a prisoner exchange and is later listed as being an officer on the privateer Phoenix, which sailed in 1780. John Wing of Dartmouth was appointed a second lieutenant on the Massachusetts privateer sloop America in 1778. The ship had been commissioned in September of the previous year and was one of the more successful private warships. Cornelius Howland of Dartmouth was among the unlucky privateers captured while attacking British shipping in the North Sea. He was sent off to prison in Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. Another reliable source lists the 11 Dartmouth men who were occupants of Mill Prison after the local sloop Charming Sally was captured by a Royal Navy man of war. Once the American government's embargo, another interesting chart. Massachusetts led the way in privateer commissions. Almost twice the next popular state. Of course, we have to remember that Massachusetts at the time included present state of Maine. The next slide. Oh, that's the last of them. We talked about the flags earlier. It's interesting to see all the different patterns. I think George Washington first used the stars in a circle, but that one's kind of a star arrangement. There's the various rows. That's pretty much all I have for us today. I just want to end with one little story to give you a little flavor for what the local men went through. This is an account from New Bedford resident John Hathaway. He was 85 years old in 1839 when he recounted some of his youthful experiences in the Revolution to local amateur historian Henry Howland Crapo. Crapo tracked down a number of city elders who had lived through the war, and this is the story he collected from Hathaway, who had been a resident of Bedford Village all his life. He was apprenticed to a boat builder named Thomas Hathaway, probably a relation. Thomas Hathaway made whaleboats for whaling merchant Joseph Roach and other people. This is his personal account. I was whaling summer before the war and arrived home in a sloop of about 75 tons. The fall before the war was declared. Sloop Friendship, Captain William Clagan, Seth Russell, Daniel Smith were the owners. William Clagan, Joseph Roach, Joseph Russell carried on whaling, blubber, and scuttled hogsheads. I enlisted in Captain Thomas Kempton's, afterwards Colonel Kempton, company of volunteers, and went to Boston in May 1775. Stayed there 8 months. Then came home, joined militia 3 months, served in Boston February, March, and April 1776 under Captain Benjamin Dillingham of Acushnet. After that service was through, he found some appeal in the privateering business. Went on board privateer brig Rising Empire, 16 carriage guns, a state vessel built in Fairhaven. Was in her 4 months. She was in commission, but 2 months. She would not sail. Which meant she had some flaw of design or rigging that she just wasn't a fast sailor. If you weren't a fast sailor, you would have a very short career in the privateer business. Let me get back to his story. Richard Weldon, a vineyard man, commanded her, took no prizes in her. In fall of 1776, enlisted on board of the Rhode Island-based privateer sloop Broome. Captain Weldon, the same as above, was out only 11 days and took 3 prizes and brought them in here, 1 ship and 2 brigs, loaded with sugar, wine, and mahogany right from Jamaica. I think these vessels were all burnt. Took 1 brig 3 days out and 2 other vessels 5 days out, which was Sunday morning. No gun fired. Broome had 60 men, 70 or 80 tons. Like I say, the best prize was one you didn't have to fight for. 11 days, they captured 3 ships without firing a shot. The note about them being burnt, very often, if you didn't have enough men on board your privateer to put a prize crew, sail it back to port for sale, and then keep sailing around, you just stole the most valuable cargo off it, put the crew in whaleboats, said good luck getting to land, and burnt the ship. Back to his story. Afterwards, the same fall, went on board sloop Sally, 115 tons of 10 guns and 60 men. Francis Broome, master of Connecticut, owned by Broom and Sears of Connecticut, same as owned the Broom. Was on board the Sally from November 1776 to February 1777, cruising all the time. Took 2 prizes, 1 brig and 1 schooner fisherman, which was sent in somewhere to the east. Had no engagement. 2 more captures without a fight. During the cruise, fell in with ship and convoy. Yeah, the luck wouldn't last long. During the cruise, fell in with ship and convoy of 5 sails. She was the ship and the 5 sails escaped. We fought her 1.5 hours, had no one hurt. He hulled us, shot lodged in blankets in forecastle. We hauled off to stop the leak, and she made sail for her convoy. We afterwards went into Bay of Biscay and dogged a ship in the night and got close to a 64-gun ship, a 2-decker called Nonesuch. We didn't think in the night she was a man of war. She fired upon us from sunrise till 8 o'clock. And when her shot nearly reached us, we gave ourselves up. She carried us into Plymouth, England, and I was a prisoner 2 years and 3 months in Mill Prison at a place close by Plymouth. Afterwards, at Howland's Ferry, serving with the local militia again. That's all we have. Any questions or comments? Thank you.
I don't know if you had heard the term cow yard. Cow yard,
Cow yard?
it's the area between Michon Point and Little River. And the story I've heard is that the
Cattle.
Quaker farmers there were willing to sell their cattle to the British ships for food.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you had come across any information on, it's still called the cow yard today.
One of the reasons that the British always had warships stationed in this area was twofold. The colonists had a habit of leaving their cattle pastured on islands off the coast all summer. And anytime you were sailing by and you needed some fresh beef or mutton or whatever you could find, they would send a party ashore, steal all the cattle or sheep and bring it back to the ship. And there were the Quakers, for the most part, tried to stay neutral in the war. They were not so much pacifists as I think a minority population in these fervently patriotic parts of the country, and a lot of them did sell provisions to the British. And they would sell them to the American Army too. They were just practical businessmen. If you had the cash, one of the biggest problems during the wartime is there was virtually no money around, but British captains, British ships had treasure chests filled with money that they used to buy provisions, and they would very often find sympathetic farmers to buy produce from.
You're very isolated there. I mean, it's halfway between Westport and...
Well, I wish Marsha Cornell was here.
She probably would know something on that.
Well, one of the first times I met her, she told me the story. She says, "Oh, you're a historical researcher." Said, "There's a story in my family that a British warship anchored off of Michon Point and sent a boat ashore, and was it one of her ancestors?
There was a
There was
Cornell
a
farm.
Cornell
On the
Michelle.
point,
Yeah.
said they wrote ashore and said, we have some, terribly sick people on here. Can you find us a doctor? And reportedly, her relation drove all the way from Michelle Point to New Bedford to find a doctor to come back and sail out and rowed them out to treat these British sick folks. And your question makes sense. If they would find a sympathetic farmer,
Well, it wouldn't necessarily have to be sympathetic. I mean, if a British came ashore with a bunch of guns and you had cattle, you might say, help yourself. And they might say, okay, and then they might, leave some money for you.
it was much more common for them to try to buy provisions from the colonials than steal it. There was a lot of that going on in Rhode Island. They very often just would send a barge out, land a troop on the shore, and go to the closest farm, steal everything they could, rush back to the boats before the alarm was sounded and the Minutemen would get there. But there's a well-documented story of this guy from over at Howland's Ferry, which was the ferry line going from Stonebridge to Rhode Island proper, who got prosecuted for driving a herd of cattle to the shore to sell to the British. The local militia thwarted the business deal, and they prosecuted him for consorting with the enemy. So, somebody from South Dartmouth, if they get caught selling stuff to the British, the Sons of Liberty would have tarred and feathered them, drove them out of town, or confiscated their property, prosecuted them. They were pretty stringent about dealing with the British. But I think that's very likely to have happened.
Just one brief comment. One of the ways that I got involved in local research when I was a college student, I did a paper on money and banking in Old Dartmouth, because I was interested in doing some research in the New Bedford Library. I discovered the genealogy room. And in that process, I found out that some of what Bob alluded to tonight, the insurance money from the marine insurance companies, which accumulated all of the premiums that they collected for all of these privateers and other merchants, became kind of the incentive for the banks to start lending money. The formation of all the early banks in New Bedford, commercial banks, came from the surplus of money collected for marine insurance of vessels, like we're talking about. So I thought I'd add that to this thing, because it's an interesting part of our early commerce. I remember being fascinated by some of the rules of the local banks. They wouldn't loan money to anybody who lived more than 10 miles from the bank, stuff like that. And then when they were short of specie has to do with hard currency, they'd send a sloop up to Boston to get a load of specie to bring down, because they didn't want to deal with the continental dollars or whatever it was. But the 5-cent savings bank in New Bedford was one of the early banks, the state chartered banks. But anyway, Bob, I think that was terrific. We had a few things to enjoy and wet your whistle and a couple of goodies.